Welcome everyone to this month's webinar, The Future is Now, Advancing Parkinson's Treatments Through Clinical Trials. My name is Donna Greening and I'm a Programs and Services Coordinator at Parkinson Canada. Before we begin, there are a few items I want to cover. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of Inuit, Métis, and First Nations peoples. We've enabled closed captioning for the benefit of attendees who may be hearing impaired. You can turn on or off closed captioning on your own screen by clicking on the CC Live Transcript button and then clicking on Show Subtitle or Hide Subtitle. Please note that this feature uses auto transcriptions, so there might be some spelling errors along the way. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see Q&A and chat buttons. Later on in the webinar, we'll have a few minutes for questions, including ones that were submitted when you registered. So if you have a question, be sure to write it into the Q&A window. The chat window is there for you to say hello and talk amongst yourselves. If you want everyone in attendance to see your comments, make sure your chat window is set to send to everyone. You can change who your comments are sent to by clicking on the drop-down arrow beside the comment box. Before we start, we're going to share a video message from our President and CEO, Dr. Karen Lee.
Over 100,000 Canadians live with Parkinson's. We have one of the highest rates in the world. My name is Karen Lee. I'm the CEO of Parkinson Canada. My late grandfather lived with Parkinson's disease, and I know very well the importance of family and how they have to come together to support one another, but most importantly, the person living with Parkinson's. That is why I am dedicated and committed to ensuring Parkinson Canada continues to empower those living with Parkinson's. Each year, our programs and services reach over 10,000 people. We are a community. We are here not only for the person living with Parkinson's, but their family, friends, and their care network to ensure we all continue to thrive. Our advocacy efforts are focused on raising the voices of people affected by Parkinson's. Our Parkinson Advisory Council is made up of people affected by Parkinson's from across the country. They bring a diverse background and experience, but most importantly, they provide me and the organization with advice on topics that are important to them and their community. As a scientist, I know the importance of investing in bold and novel ideas that lead to breakthrough discoveries. At the same time, bringing researchers, clinicians, and people living with Parkinson's to collaborate to push the needle in our understanding of Parkinson's disease. We invest in the next generation of researchers and clinicians to ensure that we continuously understand the Parkinson's disease and also the care management of people affected by Parkinson's. When I'm in the community, I want people to know that Parkinson Canada is with them in every step of their journey with Parkinson's disease. People often ask, when is the right time to connect with Parkinson Canada? Is it when they have their first diagnosis? Is it when their symptoms get worse? Or is it when they need more information and resources? The answer is now. Researchers and clinicians are working tirelessly to find a cure. Meanwhile, every single day, 25 more Canadians are diagnosed with Parkinson's. Our goal is to empower people affected by Parkinson's to live well now.
Now let's get started. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Dawn Richards, the founder of 502 Labs, Inc. and Director of Patient and Public Engagement at Clinical Trials Ontario. She earned a PhD in analytical chemistry from the University of Alberta and has experienced in a variety of roles during the past 2 decades. It was her own diagnosis with rheumatoid arthritis almost 20 years ago that started her journey to combine her passion for science with making the most of her diagnosis. She advocates for disease awareness, access to treatment and research options, and including patients as partners on research teams and in decision-making. In her role at Clinical Trials Ontario, Dawn is charged with executing on the organization's strategic pillar of patient and public engagement. Welcome, Dr. Richards.
Thanks very much, Donna. And it's my pleasure to be here today with all of you and with Marilyn so that we can help you learn a little bit more about clinical trials and help you make your own informed decisions. So today I will talk to you about three things in my presentation: a bit about the organization that I work for. I'll give you some basics about clinical trials and a bit to help you find a clinical trial or look up a clinical trial if you feel like that's something you'd like to do. So Clinical Trials Ontario is an organization that's funded primarily by the Government of Ontario. And really our goal and our role is to make Ontario a better place to do clinical trials. While I am based in Ontario, I can let you know that everything I'll talk to you about today about clinical trials applies all across Canada. So I know that many of you I'm seeing in the chat are from all across the country. So everything that I'll talk to you today about is applicable to you. So the organization I work for has three basic strategic pillars. One is to help streamline how clinical trials happen. The second is to engage, like I'm doing with you today, to help individuals make informed decisions about participating in trials or about participating on trial teams and bringing their lived experience to those teams. And thirdly, we're about promoting Ontario as a place to do clinical trials. So let's jump into some basic information about clinical trials for you. So what are they? I'm guessing most of you know that clinical trials are a type of research, and they're the research that involves people. They are set up to answer specific questions, and they test what we call health-related interventions. An intervention is really just a fancy word for treatment. So we set up clinical trials to answer things like, is the treatment safe? Maybe does it help improve or cure Parkinson disease, or does it help people live longer with Parkinson? Or does it help them live better with Parkinson and improve your quality of life? So it's not always about curing a specific disease. There's lots of other questions that clinical trials can answer. And well, I think we a lot of times think about interventions or therapies being drugs. Clinical trials can be used to study a lot more in addition to drugs. So it might be something like a device. So I know that in the Parkinson space, for example, actually I have a friend who lives with Parkinson, and she's had a surgery where she's had electrodes placed in her brain. And so she has basically brain stimulation, and that's a device that's gone through clinical trials. There might be surgery trials for a new type of surgery, maybe a new radiation therapy approach, might be a new diagnostic procedure, and it can be things such as diet or lifestyle, such as exercise interventions. So while I'm going to focus most of the talk today about drugs, just keep in mind that if you're interested in a clinical trial, it might be beyond just drugs. And so why do we do trials in the first place? Well, we do trials to generate research data or evidence about whatever we're studying. And what that ultimately helps people do is decide on what therapies might work best for people. So it helps a lot of different people make decisions. It might help physicians make decisions about the therapies that they talk to their patients about. It helps Health Canada make decisions about what therapies they consider safe and efficacious for Canadians. It helps decision makers in the healthcare system decide on what therapies might be available in their jurisdiction. And it helps people who are doing clinical trials, such as clinicians and researchers, whether they're in academic institutions or in industry, decide if they will continue their research with these different therapies. So clinical trials generate evidence, And that evidence is used to make decisions by a number of different people. So I mentioned that I'm mostly going to focus here on clinical trials for drugs. And maybe you're familiar with the fact that clinical trials happen in different phases, and each of those phases is really designed to answer a specific question about whatever intervention, in this case, a drug that you're studying. So there are typically 4 phases. I'm going to go through each one of these for you, just so you can understand a little bit more about them. So phase 1 is when, this is also called first in human. So this is the first time that the drug in this case is given to people. And keep in mind that in many instances, the drug has been studied for many years in the lab, in animals even, and in cell lines. And so a lot of data exists about the drug. We have an idea of how it should work in people, but really until it goes into people, we're not quite 100% sure. These are small studies, maybe 20 to 80 people. And the aim here really is to establish, is the drug safe in people? What the dose should be in people. Again, we'll have an idea before phase 1 what the dose should be, and it's about helping deduce what that maximum dose could be or what the most effective dose could be. And also side effects. We watch for side effects throughout clinical trials. And these individuals are monitored really closely. So they're not just given a drug and off they go. They're monitored really closely by the team that's doing the study. As I mentioned, it's a small number of participants. It's usually the time frame of weeks. So short studies, small number of participants, and here safety in people is one of the primary outcomes that we're looking at. So drugs don't always make it past the first phase. It really depends on what the results of that phase are. If whoever is running the study decides to move, in this case, this drug into phase 2, that's a whole nother study. It's designed completely differently from the phase 1 study. And here we're looking at what's called efficacy, and that's really, does the drug do what it's supposed to do? So in phase 1, often people are what are called healthy volunteers, so they don't have the condition that the drug is intended for. But in phase 2, it will go into people, for example, in your case, it would go into people that live with Parkinson's, and we're looking at, does the drug do what it's supposed to do? The dose continues to be tweaked. And again, as I mentioned before, we're always monitoring side effects. These are larger numbers of participants, say in the range of hundreds of people, and these will usually last in the time frame of months. It can depend. It depends how long it takes to recruit the number of people that are required, when they came on, etc. So these are kind of general goalposts for you around time frames. Now, again, depending on the results from phase 2, the drug may or may not go on to a phase 3 study. So it's not always a given, but if it does happen to go to a phase 3 study, these studies are in many thousands of people. Again, we're looking at how long the effects of the drug last. We're continuing to learn and observe about dose and side effects. And phase 3 studies often have a time frame of years. And you might hear about randomized clinical trials. And a randomized trial is when 2 or more treatments or treatment arms are compared against each other. And that's done to reduce the bias in the study results. And when we say randomized, it means that the individuals participating are assigned by chance. So the investigators or the people who are running this study don't know what arm of the study the participants are in. The participants won't know either. And so again, these designs all help us to answer specific questions about the drug. And also they're designed to reduce bias when the data are analyzed. So again, throughout the study, the participants are monitored closely. Participants often have to fill out a study diary or provide information. And I know Marilyn's going to talk about her experience a bit later. And I believe that she's been in a phase 3 study. So just to give you some idea. So based on the results from the phase 3 study in Canada, whoever's running the study or sponsoring the study can apply to Health Canada to have, in this case, the drug approved for, to market, so access to a large number of people. And that's when phase 4 studies come in. So these happen actually after Health Canada has approved the drug to be marketed to the public at large in Canada. And they're sometimes called post-marketing surveillance. And that's because the drug is at this point marketed, but it's now potentially in tens of thousands of people. So we'll be able to study side effects in a large number of people. And these can go on for years, basically after drugs come to market. Health Canada has a database that people or clinicians can input side effects into after something has gone to market. So those are the basic phases of clinical trials. So they're really, each of those phases is designed to answer a different question about the drug. Important to know that once a drug starts if it starts in phase 1, it may not make it to the market. It really depends on what the results are and who is sponsoring those studies and what, again, what the results are. So you may have heard of placebo, and you may worry if you're looking for a clinical trial about being potentially assigned to the placebo arm of the study. So here's a bit of information about placebo. So in the case of drugs, the placebo looks just like the intervention that actually works in people or that's being tested, but the placebo does not have any effect on the condition being studied. So sometimes you hear them called sugar pills. So they're basically inactive, but they look exactly the same as the active therapy. And again, these are another form of reducing bias within the study is when people don't know which pill they're taking. And placebos are only used when it's ethically okay to do so. So if there is a particular standard of care that individuals take for a condition, then a placebo will not be used. And instead, the intervention will be compared to the current standard of care, the current treatment for that condition. So what if you're interested in finding a clinical trial or looking for one? So there's a few different ways you can do this. One is you might talk to your healthcare provider. Chances are in the Parkinson space, you're under the care provision of a specialist, and they will often know a bit about the studies that are happening in a particular area. You might ask Parkinson Canada if they know of any studies or could help you find a way to learn more about the trials that are happening near you. You might contact the clinic that you see or an academic hospital or organization that you know that does research. You may actually hear on TV or radio or newspaper ads for people to participate in clinical trials. Those tend to be phase 1 type studies, and they often will provide payment to participate in a study. And that's partially because those are those first in human studies where those folks are taking a little bit more of a risk than other individuals since it's the first time in people. So they might offer some compensation for participating. And then Clinical Trials Ontario also has what we call a clinical trial finder. I'll come back to that a bit later. But again, even though we're provincially based in Ontario, the Finder does allow you to search anywhere in Canada or like across Canada or any specific province or territory. So I'll touch on that in a bit. And there might be other ways that you find a clinical trial, but these are kind of some of the main ways that you might go about. It's important to know your rights if you are deciding to participate in a trial or if you're interested in research. So it's good to know that even if your healthcare provider approaches you about participating in a study, you don't have to say yes if you don't feel like this is the right choice for you. It is a very personal decision to participate in a trial. And if you say no, this should really not impact your relationship with your healthcare provider and the type of care that you receive. Trials are just another option that are out there for you. And if you're offered a trial or if you've thought about a trial, there are other options that you may wish to think about. So it's always good to know about what all the options are. And you'll have to weigh these based on your own, benefit risk profile. So option one might be receiving no treatment. Another option might be receiving a different form of treatment from that you're currently on. Or maybe you want to participate in a different type of research study and not the trial that maybe you've been approached about. Always good to talk to your healthcare providers about, what the potential benefits and risks might be about all of these options. And maybe family and friends also, whoever helps you make some of those really personal decisions. I mentioned Clinical Trials Ontario's Clinical Trial Finder. I wanted to let you know too that we did work with patients and health charities and patient organizations to develop it. I'll also maybe ask one of the individuals from Parkinson Canada if they might be able to pop the link into the chat for you, or we can always get it to you later. But as I mentioned earlier, it's easy to use. For example, under the condition, you could just put in Parkinson or Parkinson disease, and you can select location or not. By default, it will search Ontario, but then you can select any other province or territory or all across Canada. And you don't have to input everything that's there. If you can't find what you're looking for now, there's an option to sign up for alerts if something should become available at a later date for you. So that's hopefully a handy tool to have out there. And then, you may not be able to find a clinical trial. So some other things you might consider doing is, if there's not a clinical trial that's happening near you, you can contact the study team if there's a clinical trial in another location and ask if it's possible for you to participate, even though you're not close by. So, would that cost you out of pocket to travel, or maybe they have some travel support? Would they potentially be able to bring a clinical trial closer to you, like maybe to a site that you visit frequently? And that might take more time and effort, but I definitely know people who have done that. The other option is simply to keep up to date on research. So maybe you've seen a trial in the US that you're interested in, and maybe it will come to Canada. I also know people who have done that, where they've watched studies open up a few months later from their counterparts in the US, and then they've been able to participate. So there's other options. You should look into them if you're really interested in a study, and make sure you ask lots of questions about how that might affect you and your involvement in them. I get asked this a lot, and I think this was a question that was asked in advance of this webinar. And that's about, how do I know if a clinical trial is reputable or credible? And so these are some of the things that you should look out for. So, for example, the cost of the clinical trial should be covered. So you should not be asked for like an entrance fee to participate, or to even cover the cost of the study treatment. Those are things that should not be costing you, but you might have to pay, for example, parking at the site, or maybe it's a long site visit, so you might need to get a snack that day or something like that. So there might be some out-of-pocket costs. But again, you can ask about what those are and see if that's doable for you. But a big red flag there is if there's some kind of weird entrance fee, or again, if you're being asked to pay for the study treatment, those should not be happening. You should look closely at the qualifications of the clinical trial team. So as an example, are these individuals who are known in the field? Have they been studying, for example, or working in the area of Parkinson for many years? Sometimes they're affiliated with academic institutions. Just take a look at those types of things. All clinical trials in Canada have to be approved by Health Canada. Not many people think about that, but it's good to go in there and ask if that's the case. The other group that has to approve clinical trials happening at a specific site is what's called a research ethics board. So Health Canada, and then the local research ethics board. For example, if it's at an institution, the institution will have a research ethics board, sometimes called an REB, and they will have approved and reviewed. So you can ask if this has been approved. It should say that in the informed consent. And the institution or organization where the clinical trial is happening also has to review and approve this. So they have liabilities associated with hosting clinical trials, and they'll have had to review and approve that internally. So that's another question to ask. In addition to this, these are kind of similar to how, things you might factor in when you think about a clinical trial. Even if you're interested in a study, like if it meets all of these things for you, you will have to meet the eligibility criteria to be in the study. And that's kind of like a checklist of things that you have to meet. And hopefully Marilyn talks a bit about this too, in order to participate in the study as well. So these are just like some good things to kind of check mark off if you're interested in studies. I talked a little bit earlier about something called informed consent. And when you hear this, you might think of a specific form that will have all the information for you about the study and who's involved in the study, who, if you have questions, you can ask about the study, et cetera. And that's one part of informed consent. Really important to know that you're participating in a clinical trial is voluntary. So, and even along with that, you can decide to withdraw from the study at any time. So it's voluntary. You can leave the study at any time, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. But also important that consent is ongoing. So you don't just sign a form and like off you go. You should feel free to ask questions at any time throughout the study to make sure that you feel okay with things, you feel okay with the process, all of those things. You should feel very involved as a participant in the study and informed. So make sure that you feel like you know what's going on if that's really important for you. So basically, informed consent is more than just that piece of paper, and it's ongoing throughout your participation in the study. If you do decide to withdraw, if you have provided data or human biological material, so that might be blood, that might be urine, that might be other things, you can ask for those to be taken out of the study as well. This may or may not be possible for a variety of reasons, but you certainly can ask for that to happen if that's your wish. So I think you've seen this on a few slides. There are going to be different potential benefits and risks for each study that comes along. It's up to you to decide if you feel that participating provides benefits that outweigh the potential risks. And those potential benefits and risks will be part of the informed consent form, so they'll be described for you. And this is another area where you should feel free to ask any and all questions until you feel okay with the answers that you've received and that you understand the information that's being provided back to you. This is a really important part of making your decision. So it's important that you feel comfortable with the information that you're getting. I talked about the fact that you can leave a clinical trial at any time, even if you originally thought that that was in your best interest. You don't have to provide a reason. You might be asked for one, but you certainly don't have to provide a reason. However, you are encouraged to let people know about your decision, and that's for your own safety, so that they can make sure that if you need any potential lab tests or physical exams before you safely stop the trial, that happens. And you're also encouraged, if that's the way that you're leaning towards withdrawal, you should really have a conversation with the trial team about your decision. Ask questions again, that's part of the informed consent process. And just like deciding to participate in the study, making sure that that's the best decision for you at that time. And I touched on the fact that you, if you've provided data and any samples, you can ask for that to be removed basically from the study as well. And as I mentioned, that may or may not be possible. So all of this information is from Clinical Trials Ontario's website. On the right-hand side of the page, there's a patients and public section. And I wanted to let you know too that although I'm not bilingual, I know that there was a question about this as we started. All of this information in the patients and public side is available in both English and French. So everything that I talked about today is from the Learn More About Clinical Trials section of the site, and that is available in both English and French for you. That's it for me. My email address is down here in the bottom right-hand corner. I'm always happy to be approached after the webinar if you think of any questions that weren't answered here, or if you have any other general questions. And hopefully Marilyn can now bring this all together in terms of her own experiences, and I'll feel a little less theoretical to you as she walks through things. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Dawn. Using the Clinical Trials Ontario search tool is a great way to watch for US trials that might come to Canada that many of us may not have even thought of. It's also very helpful to know those questions to ask when determining if a trial is right for you. Now, we're privileged to hear from Marilyn Adamkowski, a participant in the Roche-Padova Parkinson's disease trial at the Toronto Memory Care Clinic. Marilyn grew up as a middle child in a large family with 5 sisters and 2 brothers. She describes it as a happy, busy home filled with love, laughter, and music, particularly with a house full of teenagers. Family celebrations were centered around the piano. Growing up in Scarborough, Marilyn remembers happy days filled with lots of running and skipping games and competitive board games. Given the opportunity, she will happily get out her bowling ribbons, swimming crests, or newspaper clippings from her days as a pitcher to regale her family. Marilyn's family valued education, and with her degree from York University, she followed a sister and brother into teaching and taught at the elementary level for 30 years. Marilyn married the love of her life, Gary, 46 years ago, and together they raised 3 children. And now, when they're not traveling the world, they are sure to be spending time with their 6 grandchildren. They enjoy playing bridge, attending theater, and hosting dinner for family and friends. Marilyn also enjoys lawn bowling and exercises 6 days a week. Before the pandemic interrupted travel plans, the pair were often off on adventures to places like Thailand, Dubai, Costa Rica, Panama, Australia, and Japan. Marilyn was diagnosed with Parkinson's in January of 2020 and is under the care of a neurologist, and she feels that the most important advice from her doctor is to stay active. She's currently on levodopa-carbidopa to control her tremors. Welcome, Marilyn.
Thank you, Donna. As mentioned, I was diagnosed with Parkinson in January of 2020, just before the pandemic shut down the world. My participation in the clinical trial started in the October of that same year. I think my willingness to participate in the clinical trial was prompted by my love of learning. Let me explain. Education and continuous learning were emphasized and encouraged in my family, whether it was educational courses like new strategies to teach maths or updates on new curriculums offered by the board, or just taking interest courses on gardening, cooking. I always enjoyed learning. During the pandemic, I watched many lifelong learning lectures that were now offered on Zoom. One lecture on Alzheimer's research caught my attention, as there is a strong history of Alzheimer's on my mother's side of the family. My grandmother, my mother, her brothers, and a sister, who all lived into their 90s, suffered memory loss. Since there is a strong correlation between Parkinson and Alzheimer's, I listened carefully to the lecture. At the conclusion of the lecture, I contacted the clinic and did a memory test for Alzheimer's and Parkinson. The test showed normal memory recall for my age, 72. Additionally, the researcher said that the clinic had been approved and that they were soon starting a clinical, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial to evaluate the efficacy and the safety of the intravenous drug in participants with early Parkinson disease, and wondered, would I be interested in participating? After careful consideration, I agreed to participate, and my husband and I went for an all-day introduction to the many parts of the study. This meeting included meeting my own personal clinical coordinator, who explained in depth what the trial entailed. She went over the clinical consent form, which was a 21-page document that outlined the whole trial, including possible benefits and risks. I also needed to sign a form giving permission to the medical team to access my medical history. During the orientation, I also met the doctors associated with the trial and the clinic. One doctor was a clinical practitioner who would receive my medical history from my own family doctor, as well as the neurologist associated with the study, who would be doing the videotaping session to record my tremors as I performed various tasks. Orientation also included a brief introduction to the various tests and scans that I needed to complete. These included blood and urine samples, an MRI, a DAT scan, and an ECG. And while the technicians don't offer or comment on my results, I personally found it interesting to investigate and to learn what a DAT scan is. It makes for wonderful dinner conversation. In terms of benefits of participating in the study, it was explained that my health may or may not improve, but the information that is learned may help other people with Parkinson. And of course, the risks were also outlined. Although I have not experienced any symptoms like itching, skin rash, nausea, or an allergic reaction, I was always closely monitored by a nurse. It has been clear throughout the study that any unusual symptoms would be taken seriously and that I would be well cared for. In terms of logistics, making an 18-month commitment to the study was daunting, but it seemed to me that by participating in the trial, I would receive more medical attention and insight to this diagnosis. For me, the distance to the center was just a 20-minute drive, and there was compensation for my traveling time and/or parking fees. Some of you who might be considering making a commitment might wonder how it might affect your travel plans. Like me, you might be ready to book that next family vacation or a European adventure. It was made clear that my appointments and infusions could be accommodated. I just submitted to the center our travel dates well in advance, and my visits and infusions were adjusted as needed. As part of the trial, I was provided with a smartphone and a smartwatch for active and passive monitoring of my daily movements. These daily tests take about 5 minutes and include speech, dexterity, voice, information processing, tracing a shape, hand turning, and an at-rest tremor test. These tests are all prompted by the phone. There is no thinking involved. The information is downloaded to the clinic, and the data is collected over the length of the trial to help better understand the effects of Parkinson's disease on my movements. These tests are easy to do and take limited time. In fact, the test is just part of my morning routine. In between my morning coffee and my jazzercise exercise class, I make a little bit of time to complete the prompted tests. Additionally, once a month, I go to the clinic to meet with the neurologist connected with the trial. I am instructed not to take my medication the morning of my session because the first part of the day is a tape session to document how my movements are during an off state. The session includes a series of movements, lifting my hands, tapping my toes, clenching and unclenching my hands. After this, I can take my medication and then proceed to have my blood pressure taken, blood drawn, and an ECG if necessary. Finally, the infusion of the intravenous drug is then started. This infusion is usually 1 hour in length, and then 1 hour of monitoring to make sure I do not have any reaction to the infusion. Most days I bring a book, a snack, and sometimes I enjoy a nap. All the associates, the staff, the nurses, the doctors who I have dealt with have been professional, kind, informative as they record the data and the results outlined by the protocol of the trial. I feel comfortable during these visits to ask questions and to talk about any changes or challenges that I have noticed. While the day can be long, I take the time to reflect on my journey and take advantage of the experts that I now have access to. Parkinson is undoubtedly a difficult diagnosis, but looking for opportunities to engage, to take an active role, has given me a better sense of control over my future. Whether I am getting the placebo or the trial drug, participating gives me a sense of doing something purposeful. I feel that I am actively doing something to help researchers to further the body of knowledge around this disease. Personally, Participating encourages me to research and to be more attentive to my symptoms and changes in my body as the disease progresses. This clinical trial may have some benefits for me and hopefully for the thousands of people who are diagnosed in the future. I would strongly encourage anyone with Parkinson's disease to seek out a clinical trial in your community. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marilyn, for sharing your experiences with us today. You provided a really great window into what it's like to be involved in the trial that you're participating in. We're going to go right now to some questions that were submitted. This one would be for Marilyn. Did you have any concerns or reservations before deciding to participate? And if so, how did you work through them?
No, as I mentioned, I knew about the clinic and the doctor who was in charge of the clinic. I had seen her on a couple of lifelong lecture series. And so I knew she was legitimate. I thought about the trial and I thought, you know what? It's the pandemic. I'm not doing anything. Why don't I go and hear about it, see what is involved? And that led me to my decision to participate.
Thank you. This question is for Dawn. There were several questions that were submitted, and I know you've already touched on them during your presentation, but they all surround how do you become part of a trial? How do you become a patient candidate? Or how does someone find out if their spouse might qualify for any of the drugs that are being researched? Is there anything else you wanted to add over and above what you presented?
Yeah, so I think just to re-emphasize that for each clinical trial, there will be different what's called eligibility criteria. And so you really have to just do some homework around A, are you potentially interested in the study? And B, do you seem to meet the eligibility criteria, which may mean you're a certain age, it may mean you have or have not taken certain medications. It could be a whole range of different things. And what you're best to do is contact someone at the site where the trial is happening to ask questions about what the eligibility criteria really mean and to ask any questions you might have about participating. So really anyone can be a participant, but it really depends on what the criteria are for the study and whether or not you can be eligible, even if you wish to participate.
Thank you. There's a follow-up question. What conditions might disqualify a person from participating? And I know it depends on the trial itself, but are there broad disqualification criteria?
Again, it really just depends on how the study has been designed. I can give you an example. For example, when the COVID vaccines were being studied, they excluded people like myself who are immunocompromised. And so their reason for doing that was that they felt that it was going to make the data, I'll say, too messy. So I already live with an immunocompromising condition. COVID is also immunocompromising. I take lots of medications for my rheumatoid arthritis, and those might all interfere with looking at the data for the vaccine. So it just really depends on the study and how it's been designed and set up. So it's really hard to answer that broadly without, you just need to look at each study and ask some questions about it.
Great. Thank you so much. Marilyn, what advice would you have for someone who's participating in a clinical trial?
I think that you go into it with an open mind. You also go into it, you have access to a doctor, a neurologist who is not your own neurologist. You spend a day with them. You can tap into their knowledge. Yeah, you're with them all day, ask questions and they answer them. Does that answer the question? I'm not sure.
Yeah, for sure. To follow up on that, Dawn, um, are there some specific questions that you might want to suggest that someone ask if they're looking into a specific clinical trial?
Yeah, and I think I'd ask Marilyn to chime in too. I think, one of the things I heard Marilyn talking about was, well, she was in this during the pandemic. She was thinking about how, like, if I'm traveling, does this mean I can't participate? Like, it's kind of around how is it going to affect my day to day? And especially for people working, that might be very different from people who are retired. But how would this affect my routine? Like what's involved? So how many site visits are there? Where are they? How long might the trial be? Some studies can go on for many years, and that, for some people might be a really big deal. For others, it might not be. What level of involvement might there be for me? Marilyn's talked a little bit about every day she fills out her diary. So are there lots of surveys? Is there a diary? What kind of samples do I have to give? Marilyn, are there other things that were really interesting for you to ask about?
On the day-to-day basis, as I mentioned, I'm given a smartphone and a smartwatch. During the interview session, I am shown how to do all the tests. The tests on the smartphone are extremely easy to do. It starts off by asking, did you take your medication? How are you feeling? It has a scale. It might be, with you, it shows your right hand, trace this shape, squares, figure eights, and then do the same thing with your left hand. Those tests are very easy to do on a daily basis. No problem, no prompting. The only time consuming part is making the day to go down to the clinic to participate in the taping session with the neurologist, and then the taking of blood and urine, doing the ECG if that's necessary, and then the 1 hour infusion. But the test trial that I'm involved with, they give me dates they've given me 5 months in advance. So I can look at my calendar and say, okay, great. I just mark them off and go with it. If one date wasn't convenient, and so they were able to change it. It doesn't require a lot of time. What I lose in the day that I go to the clinic for the infusion, I gain in medical knowledge from the doctors involved with the clinic. As an example, they take your blood pressure constantly during the infusion every 15 minutes. It interrupts my nap sometimes, but the blood pressure is taken. Well, after a few months, they noticed that my blood pressure was going up. So they said, maybe you should contact your own family doctor and look into this. So I did. It turns out that my blood pressure was elevated, and I started on a very low dose of blood pressure medication. This is something that I would never have found out about unless I had the information that I was getting from the clinical trial. It was so difficult during the pandemic to get in touch with the doctor. I felt great. So there was no reason to go to it. So I think you have access to medical experts on a monthly basis that you don't know. They report on the blood tests that are done. They say, your blood tests have come back clear for everything. Great. So giving a day off a month, I say no, that's it. All the advice is worth it.
That's good to know. A question was submitted. This person does not have a neurologist. Could they still be accepted for a clinical trial?
Yes, the answer is yes. So you don't necessarily have to be like referred to a clinical trial through your own specialist or provider. You can certainly, if you're interested in one that you find, just reach out to the site and have a conversation with them about what it might look like to be involved and discuss your potential eligibility, learn about potential benefits and risks, ask all kinds of questions. So no, you don't necessarily have to be referred through a healthcare provider.
Okay, great, thank you. Someone else has asked if there are trials for people who have dementia.
Without knowing a lot of specifics, I think so, yes. But it would really depend, I think, on where you are and, eligibility criteria, et cetera. So that's something for sure. You could go to our trial finder and you could put in dementia and see what pops up there and follow what you might be interested in there.
Great. Yeah, and we've also had several questions asked about where people specifically live and what trials are available. So I guess the best place to go is to that clinical trials finder and input what they're looking for and where they are and see what's available in their own area. Is that correct?
That's probably your best bet for sure, because it's really going to change based on where the sites are, et cetera. So that's what I would encourage. Yes, Donna.
Okay. Someone has asked if they're in a clinical trial, how important is it to take their medications on time?
So I'm not sure if that's referring to the trial medications or your other medications.
I think they
Uh,
probably mean their other medications.
I think that would be something you would talk to the trial team about. And Marilyn, I might ask you based on your own experiences, if you were already on medications, what your approach was. But that would be my kind of blanket advice is speak to the trial team about any questions you have about that. Marilyn?
I just take my levodopa, and the only time that I don't take it is the morning, the day of the infusion. I don't take it that morning because the neurologists, they do a tape session and they want to see me at an off state. So I haven't taken my medication since 7 o'clock the evening before, and then I probably won't take it till about 10 or 11. And so the tapes that they do, I did ask, I said, does anybody look at these tapes? And she said, yes, they do, because they ask, they send information, ask the participant to do the motion slower, standing up, sitting down. So those tapes are all done. Any medication like the blood pressure medication that I started, uh, I reported that when I started taking it. My booster shots for the pandemic, the flu shots, they had specifics around that. My flu shot couldn't taken, it should only be taken 10 days before the infusion or 10 days after the infusion. So, these are all questions that you ask and you talk about, and they're just full of information for you. Yes.
Great. We've got time for one last question for Dawn. At the end of a trial, or perhaps during the trial, are participants given results from tests such as MRIs, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really does depend on the trial. So I would encourage you to, again, those would be questions that you would ask of the trial team. If you will have access to your own results from the study, or if you may have access to the general results of the study at the end of it. Again, it's really going to depend on the study. So that's a great question to ask if you're interested in that.
Great, thank you. Well, thanks to everyone for asking such great questions and to our presenters for such thoughtful responses. Thank you to everyone who's attended the webinar, and a very special thank you to Don Richards and Marilyn Adamkowski for joining us to discuss the clinical trials. In about a week's time, we're going to send you an email with a link to a recording of this webinar and any resources mentioned today. Next month's webinar, Building Your Parkinson's Healthcare Team, takes place on Wednesday, December 14th, so watch your email inboxes for more details and a registration link. An electronic copy of Every Victory Counts Canadian edition is available on our website, and you can also choose to have a hard copy mailed to you. Parkinson Canada's information and referral associates are available weekdays to answer your questions and provide you with resources. To reach them, dial 1-800-565-3000 or email information.referral@parkinson.ca. On behalf of all of us at Parkinson Canada, I'd like to thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. See you next month.